Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this month's SCI talk entitled Food, Foresight, and the Future of Farming. Do we need to revolutionize our food system? With Dave Hughes from Syngenta. Before I introduce Dave, though, just some quick housekeeping. There'll be a Q&A session at the end of the talk. So to ask your questions, make sure to type them, click in the Q&A button that you'll see at the bottom of your screen or top, depending on if you have full screen or not. And all attendees are in listen-only mode, so the questions will be asked by me at the end. But yeah, make sure to pop your questions in the Q&A button that you can find on the tab. Today, I'll be chairing this event. I am Paul Hernandez. I am a postdoctoral researcher in medicinal chemistry at the University of Oxford and part of the organizing committee of SCI Talks. But today, Dave Hughes will be speaking, who is the Head of Technology Identification and Evaluation for Crop Protection at Syngenta. Dave Hughes is responsible for new technology identification and evaluation at Syngenta Crop Protection, and his role is focused on understanding the present and potential future scientific landscapes, developing relationships with key potential partners, especially scientific collaborations. He joined the company as a chemistry team leader in 1995. We spent 10 years working on new potential pesticides. In 2005, he moved to lead an interdisciplinary team investigating the mode of action of new pesticides before moving to this role in 2010. Dave obtained his undergraduate degree in chemistry from University of Oxford, where he also did his PhD studies in synthetic organic chemistry, which after the PhD studies went on to do a postdoc in Montana State University in the US before starting his work in agricultural technology. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Dave. We're really looking forward to this talk, and the floor is yours.
Super, thanks very much. Just bear with me 1 second. Let me press a few buttons here. Okay. Right, that's okay. All right, I think we're good to go. So with a bit of luck, you can hear me okay. You can see my slide on full screen. You can see my pointer. You can see me if you want to. So I'll assume that's all right. If it's not, I'm sure somebody from the SCI will shout at me, but I will proceed on that basis. So today I'm going to be talking about the food system. The food system is the most important industrial system on the planet. Fundamentally, human beings only require 4 things in order to survive. We need air to breathe, we need water to drink, we need food to eat, and we need the ability to control our ambient environment, so things like shelter and clothing. If we have those 4 things in place, then we can survive more or less indefinitely in the absence of any kind of external factors. Now, air to breathe is around us all the time, so that's fairly straightforward. Water to drink falls from the sky in most places, so that's not too tricky either. The ability to control our ambient environment takes a bit of effort, but having solved the problem once, we can typically use that same solution for extended periods of time. But food is different. Food doesn't just happen. Food requires significant effort every single day. And for most people on the planet, it's the food system that provides their food. So the food system is a massively complex, interconnected network of literally millions of players, from giant mega corporations on the one hand, all the way down to individual players on the other, working before the farm, on the farm, after the farm, in private sector companies, in public sector institutions, charities and NGOs, individual people, all working together, doing their best to ensure that everybody has enough food to eat every single day. So it's worrying, therefore, that many credible commentators are suggesting that our food system today is somehow broken, or it's not fit for purpose, and that we need nothing short of a revolution in agriculture in order to put things right. So, for example, reckless farming is destroying the planet, we read. Serious farm pollution breaches are on the rise. Industrial farming is driving mass extinction of life on Earth, and the global food system is broken and hides huge externalities that are not taken into account in the price of our food. So this is quite strong stuff, right? And this isn't taken from the lunatic fringes of the internet. This is from mainstream UK media sources in the last 2 or 3 years. So as our society almost literally bites the hand that feeds it, it's no wonder this is having an effect on the morale of the farming community. Why is everyone turning against us, they ask, now that agri-bashing seems to be a thing? Well, is this right? Is this fair? Is this the whole story? You know, we have credible commentators like George Monbiot, for example, suggesting the system needs total transformation. So in other words, we take humanity's most important life support system and we need to rip it up and start again. That's surely quite risky, you know? It's a bit like saying that we should deconstruct an aeroplane in midair in the hope of being able to build a better aeroplane from the bits while we're still flying. So I'm not quite on the same page as George here, but I do think change is required. But before proposing what kind of change we need, I think it's important to understand our food system, in particular, what it's good at and where it struggles. And that's where I'd like to start. So the world is clearly facing some major sustainability challenges today, and agriculture is a key contributor to a number of these challenges, 4 in particular, I would suggest. The first one is pollution, particularly pollution associated with fertilizers, because fertilizers can run off farmers' fields, get into waterways, and they can catalyze the formation of algal blooms. And these algae have the net effect of sucking oxygen out of the water, creating dead zones in which nothing else can live. And these dead zones can be huge. So you're looking here at a satellite image of the north coast of the Gulf of Mexico. So for scale here, this is Houston in Texas over here. And on the right-hand side, this is the mouth of the Mississippi at New Orleans in Louisiana over here. And you can see the size of this algal bloom, over 20,000 square kilometers, leading to a dead zone of a similar size. So you can see this is a really significant environmental concern. The second area is greenhouse gas emissions. So this is a rather complicated diagram, which was produced, I think, for COP26. Highlighting the contribution of the food system to greenhouse gas emissions. So if you look at the right-hand side here, you can see that the food system is responsible for 16.5 billion tons of CO2 equivalent, which is about 29% of the total man-made greenhouse gases. And they break it down into 3 bits. The first bit is what goes on both before and after the farm gate. So before the farm, it's mainly about fertilizer manufacture. So fertilizer manufacture is very expensive in terms of greenhouse gases. The harbor process to produce nitrogen uses a lot of energy, and it also directly releases greenhouse gases. And mining minerals from the ground for fertilizers is also highly energetic. After the farm gate, it's mainly about energy for things like food processing, food retail, and the sort of things that happen in our houses, so like refrigeration and cooking. Then there's a chunk to do with food transport, so this is food miles here, and another chunk to do with food waste. And add all of those things together, that's about 10% of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. Then there's a slightly larger chunk of greenhouse gas emissions that come from the farm itself. And this is mainly not about carbon dioxide. There's a little bit here to do with on-farm energy. So this is diesel to run farm machinery, but most of this is to do with 2 other gases. It's to do with methane, which comes from ruminant animals. It also comes from paddy rice fields and also dealing with animal waste. And also oxides of nitrogen, especially nitrous oxide, that is emitted from fertilized soil. And together that accounts for about 13% of greenhouse gas emissions. And then at the bottom, we have a contribution from land use change. So this is all about destroying natural wildland and converting it into farmland, which is very expensive because you tend to burn the biomass which is existing on the wildland, which creates obviously loads of CO2. And then you plow the soil, waking up dormant microbes within the soil that start respiring. So they wake up with a big puff of carbon dioxide as well. So converting wildland into farmland is seriously expensive in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And that is something we must surely stop. The third area is biodiversity collapse. Now, I think it's true to say we know very little about the population dynamics of most species on the planet, but the ones that we do monitor all seem to be heading in the wrong direction. So for example, this is the Living Planet Index, a study published a couple of years ago, which looks at nearly 32,000 different populations of over 5,000 species of vertebrates, which of course relatively easy to study. And you can see that between 1970 and 2018, a typical decline in those populations is close to 70%, which is absolutely appalling. Now, in terms of agriculture's contribution to biodiversity collapse, it's mainly about habitat destruction. So often we see situations like this where farmland has been created where clearly there used to be pristine forest before. Now, to a first approximation, it makes no difference whatsoever what kind of agronomic practices happen in this field. In biodiversity terms, it's an absolute desert compared to the forest that was there before. We have to stop converting wildland into farmland. The fourth area is around soil degradation. Now, I get a little frustrated sometimes with conversations around soil degradation. The problem is people aren't specific enough. So, for example, you often hear phrases like X% of the world's soils are degraded. But the problem is that X can be almost any number you like. So, for example, here it's 22%, here it's 40%, 75%, 52% today, maybe 90% by 2050. So what's going on here? All these numbers can't be correct, right? Well, the problem is there are many different ways in which soil can be degraded, with many different causes and many different potential solutions. And it's also true to say that degraded soil doesn't necessarily have compromised soil fertility either, which is another complication. So to try and cut through this, I reckon there are basically 6 ways in which soils can be degraded. The first one is erosion. So keeping soil where it needs to be is a significant challenge because it can be moved by wind or by water, and we lose billions of tons of topsoil from our agricultural lands every year. The flip side to erosion is compaction, where powdery soils can be compressed by heavy machinery to the extent that plant roots struggle to penetrate through, and that, of course, compromises soil fertility. Soils can be contaminated by materials which are toxic to plant growth. So a common one is salt. So this is where the world's saltiest soils are. And if you look carefully at this map here, you can see that the saltiest soils are in essentially 2 bands, one just above and one just below the equator. So in other words, in climatically dry zones where it doesn't often rain. So if you want to farm in these regions, you've got to get water from somewhere, and farmers tend to get it from aquifers deep underground, which tends to be rather salty water. So if you continuously irrigate with this salty water year after year, these salts can accumulate in the topsoil until they reach toxic levels. So soils can be contaminated by toxic materials. The flip side to that is nutrient depletion. So soils can be depleted of the nutrients plants need in order to grow. So in parts of the world which have low inputs into agriculture, like sub-Saharan Africa, this can be a serious issue. The microbiology of the soil is important in ways that we're only just starting to understand. So, for example, we know that fungi, filamentous fungi in the soil can attach themselves to plant roots. And this is a good thing because it enables the plant to better access things like nutrients and water through the fungi. In actual fact, there's some evidence that these fungi can actually connect the root systems of different plants together, enabling those plants to communicate, which is actually quite a thought, isn't it? So the microbiology of the soil is important in ways that, like I say, we're only just starting to understand. And finally, carbon content. Carbon is really important to soil quality, not because plants absorb lots of carbon from the soil. They don't. They get their carbon from photosynthesis from the air, from carbon dioxide. But the carbon in the soil contributes to the texture of the soil. It gives it a kind of sponginess that enables the soil to hang on to things like water and nutrients, makes it less likely to erode, less likely to compact. So lots of different ways in which soils can be degraded, lots of different causes, lots of different potential solutions. So those are the 4 main ways in which agriculture can compromise environmental sustainability. And towards the end of the talk, I'll come back and say some of the things, some of the strategies that we're using to try and improve these situations. But what about the other aspect of the food system? Its primary objective is to produce enough food to feed the global population. So how is it doing there? Well, the first piece of evidence I'll show you here is this, which was published from the CSIRO, which is a research institute in Australia. So they're looking at food demand all the way back from 1500 and extrapolating forward to the middle of this century. And this is a pretty intimidating curve. I think you'll probably agree. So they come to the conclusion that by the middle of this century, we're going to have to be producing about twice as much food every year as we were producing at the start of this century, which is quite a thought. But the reason I show you this particular piece of work is that they did a second calculation, which I think is quite interesting. So they calculated that food production over the next 50 years will need to exceed that produced to date, which is a bit of a mangled sentence. So what do they mean by this? So in the 50-year window between 2010 and 2060, if we are to satisfy demand, we will need to produce more food in those 50 years than agriculture has ever produced since the dawn of farming 12,000 odd years ago up until 2010. So in other words, this light blue area under the curve here is a bit bigger than this darker blue area under the curve here, even if you extrapolate this curve all the way back to 10,000 BC. So that's quite a thought as well, isn't it? Now, I mentioned that quite a few people have had a go at estimating future food demand with a range of different results. Fortunately, though, in the summer of 2021, an academic group from Wageningen University in the Netherlands had a go at trying to pull it all together in a meta-analysis. So they used 57 global food security projections, so food demand projections, in other words, published in the peer-reviewed scientific literature, and kind of crunched them all together to try and come up with a consensus view. And their conclusion is that under business as usual scenario conditions, so nothing major structurally happens to our food system, total food consumption in 2050 will increase by 51% from a baseline of 2010. And the confidence limits on that calculation are actually pretty tight. So this looks like quite a good number. This is our best guess. So in other words, we'll need to produce about 1.5 times as much food in 2050 as we were producing in 2010. We'll come back to that in just a moment. Okay, so how have we done in the past then? So this is United Nations data that I've downloaded. This is gross global food production expressed as a dollar value, inflation adjusted and all of that, from about 1961 up until more or less the present day. And you can see by this particular measure, global food productivity has nearly quadrupled in the last 60 years or so, which is quite amazing, right? All of a sudden, a 50% increase in food production between 2010 and 2050, as I've just shown you, doesn't sound quite so intimidating, considering we've quadrupled food production in the last 60 years. In actual fact, this rate of food production is even greater than the rate of human population growth. So if you plot this in a slightly different form, this time looking at kilocalories produced per capita per day, you can see that in actual fact, our planet has never been better able to feed its human population than today, which is a great triumph, of course, for our food system. Now, some people look at this and say, okay, well, the world is producing loads of food then, plenty of food, more than enough food. But that's not actually quite the case if you look at the numbers. We're producing about 3,000 calories per person per day. But this, of course, is food production. Now, we waste about a third of the food that is produced. So we consume closer to 2,000 calories per person per day. Now, a healthy diet is generally considered to be 2,200, 2,250, something like that. The onset of malnutrition is generally considered to be about 1,800, okay? So in other words, if food was completely equitably distributed around the world, we would each receive an amount somewhere about halfway in between the onset of malnutrition and a healthy diet. So it is true to say that theoretically, we produce enough food to eliminate malnutrition from the planet, but we do not yet produce enough food to feed everybody a healthy diet. Now, this is what's happened to global farmed land area over the same time interval. And you can see over the last 60 years, global farmed area has remained more or less constant. So this is cropland in green at the bottom and pasture land for raising animals just above it in orange. And if you look closely, in fact, farmland peaked round about the turn of the millennium and has been declining slightly ever since. So this means that this massive increase in food productivity that we've seen hasn't come through simply farming an increasing footprint. And that's really good news. Instead, this massive increase in productivity has come through increasing yield per unit area. So how have we managed to do that? Well, we've got much better technologies today than we had in the 1960s. We've got better seeds, better chemicals, better fertilizer, better machinery, better information about our farming system, better ways of integrating those different technology areas together. And that is how it's been achieved. This final chart on this slide is essentially exactly the same as the one in the top left here, only I've plotted it on different scales. So what I've done, I've taken all of the data points since the turn of the millennium, and then I fitted the best straight line I could to that set of data. And you can see it really is a very good fit to a simple straight line model. Then what I did is I extrapolated that straight line through to 2050. Now, the position of the star on this chart is where we anticipate food demand being in 2050. In other words, 50% more than 2010. So you can see if this trajectory is actually maintained, then we're on course to actually exceed the amount of food that we think we're going to need, which is actually really good news. Now, we can't be complacent because we're not overshooting it really by very much. And there are plenty of pressures that could bring this line down, things like climate change, things like technology denialism, that kind of thing. But there's no sign of that in the data at the moment. So on the face of it, this is actually quite an optimistic picture. A couple of quick postscripts about land use. So some of you might be not too sure about the fact that farmland has remained more or less constant over the past 60 years, because we're used to seeing pictures like this, aren't we? This is a satellite image of the Amazonian rainforest, and you can see that the fires that have been set to clear forest to create agricultural lands are on a scale that is big enough to be seen from space. And it's true that we're clearing tens of thousands of square kilometers of jungle every year in the Amazonian rainforest to create farmland. So if farmland is being created at such an industrial rate, how come overall global farmland remains more or less constant? Well, the obvious answer is that we are losing farmland elsewhere, but we hardly ever get to hear about that, do we? So this is a bit of a quick and dirty analysis that I did a couple of years ago. So what I did is I took every country in the world, I downloaded the amount of agricultural land present in that country in both 2008 and 2018. I subtracted one from the other, sorted the list, and then these are the 5 countries that gained the most farmland over that 10-year window. And you can see that Brazil only comes in 3rd. The situation is actually worse in both Colombia and in Indonesia. But conversely, these are the 5 countries that lost the most farmland over the same time interval. And of course, this is clearly about Australia here, which was undergoing a severe drought at the time. So a lot of land was simply abandoned, I think, during that time window. But look at the USA here. The USA lost almost as much farmland as Brazil gained. Not quite, but not far short. This is primarily due to urbanization. So the expansion of towns and cities into farmland. If you add it up over the whole world lost about 200,000 square kilometers of farmland in that 10-year window, but this is only 0.4% of the total. And so as a result of that, if you plot it on a global scale, it still looks flat. Okay, another quick postscript here. So the databases that I use tend to go back to the early 1960s, but I think it's instructive to go back a little bit further in time than that. So I found this data that goes all the way back to the year 1700. So this is how land use has changed over the last 300 years. So we have cropland in green at the top, wild forest and woodland and jungle in purple, pasture land for raising animals in orange, wild grasslands in yellow, and everything else in grey at the bottom. And you can see how cropland has eaten into forest land and how pasture land has eaten into wild grassland. But let's take a little bit of a close look here, because I think there's an interesting story to tell. If we go all the way back to 1700 and add up the amount of pasture land plus the amount of cropland, it's only a very small proportion of the world's land area. It's about 5%. If we zip forward to 1850 or the middle of the 1800s, you can see that there's a bit more at this point in time. We're now up at around 10% of the world's land area. But if you look really closely, in actual fact, there's a point of inflection around about 1850. And the rate of conversion of wildland into farmland actually accelerates both cropland and pasture land. It accelerates up until about 1950 and 1960, where it levels off at pretty much today's value, as we've already seen, which is about 35% of the world's land area. So we go from 10% of the world's land area in 1850 to about 35% of the world's land area in about 1950. So let's be clear about what we're talking about here. So in this tiny 100-year window in human history, we've actually destroyed the wild habitats and natural ecosystems across a quarter of the world's land area. in what is surely the most egregiously act of environmental destruction our species has ever perpetrated. So why did this actually happen? Well, I think it's clear if we look at this chart here. This is human population growth over the last 1,000 years. So for most of this time, the population was bumping around at a low fraction of 1 billion people. And then we hit things like the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the first industrial revolution. And by the time we hit 1850, the world's population is rising at an unprecedented rate. But the agricultural systems at the time simply couldn't cope. The only way to cope with this ballooning population was to farm more land. And that's exactly what happened. So in other words, these curves here are mirroring this curve here. The most remarkable thing about this is the fact that we were able to step off this trend around about 1950, 1960, just as we were hitting this massive peak in global population growth. So how were we able to do that? Well, three things happened in the 15 or 20 years that followed the Second World War. The first thing is that this was the start of the Green Revolution. So modern plant breeding technologies were producing more productive crop varieties that were more resilient to environmental stresses. The second thing is, this was the start of the era of modern day pesticide chemistry. So pesticides were being designed based on organic chemicals rather than the nasty inorganic materials that we used before. Much more effective, much safer. The third thing that happened was all of the nitrogen processing capacity that was developed during the Second World War to produce explosives. A lot of that was repurposed to produce nitrogen fertilizers. So in the years just after the Second World War, nitrogen fertilizer became abundant and cheap. And those three things together meant that farmers could step off this treadmill of simply expanding the amount of land and instead feeding this massive peak in population through increasing their yields instead, as we have already seen. Now, I think I look at this with a kind of sense of irony, to be honest, because the sort of technologies we're talking about, pesticides, fertilizers, plant breeding technologies, they're often demonized by modern day environmentalists as being responsible for all of the ills in the environment, right? But in actual fact, it was the introduction of those technologies in the 1950s, 1960s, that prevented the complete destruction of wildlands, right? Because surely if these curves here had continued to mirror this curve here after 1950, it's obvious that there would be no wildland left on the planet anymore. Okay, let's change gears now here. So if we want to have some kind of revolution, what sort of agricultural revolution do we need? Well, Friends of the Earth are quite clear about this. So they say farming for the future, organic and agroecological solutions to feed the world. And when many people are talking about an agricultural revolution, this is the kind of revolution they are often talking about. Now, I've got nothing against farming systems like this. On the contrary, I think that diversification of our agricultural systems is a really good thing for robustness and resilience. However, I am very skeptical indeed that these kind of farming systems should be significantly more prevalent than they are today, and I'll try to explain why. So organic agriculture, for instance, seems to be based on the rather nostalgic principle that food and farming were somehow better in the past than they are today. So for example, this is quite a common meme. In fact, this is a fridge magnet that you can buy from Amazon, right? So therefore, what we should do is reject modern day farming technologies and methodologies and retreat back to more traditional farming systems. But is it really true? Was food and farming really much better in the past than it is today? So for me, to take this literally, I mean, my grandparents were growing up in the 1920s, there or thereabouts. So was food and farming better in the 1920s than it is today in the 2020s? It's always difficult to directly compare, but take a little look at this. This is data showing the number of people who died in famines decade by decade, all the way back to the mid-1800s. And in the 1920s, over 16 million people died in famines worldwide, which doesn't exactly scream a robust and reliable functioning global food system, does it? Especially if you consider that there were only 2 billion people on the planet in the 1920s. There are 8 billion people on the planet today. And you can see in the era since the onset of modern day agricultural technologies, famines on this kind of scale have been consigned to history, which is actually a really good thing. So for those of you who may be hankering after more traditional farming systems, be careful what you wish for, because there may be unintended consequences. And one of the key issues with organic agriculture is that the yields are substantially below conventional crop yields. Now, the organic industry used to push back on this, but there is now so much published evidence, it's largely uncontested these days. So, for example, this is a review that came out in 2019, stating that over all crops, the organic yield gap was 35%. So organic yields are 35% below conventional crop yields. This is a more recent review from 2021, showing a productivity gap of 29% to 44%. And another review that I quite like, it goes back a little bit further. This is based on an analysis of USDA data, American US Department of Agriculture data from the year 2014, analyzing the difference between organic and conventional yields, crop by crop and state by state, right across the United States. And the further the green bar goes out to the right-hand side, the bigger the yield deficit for organic. So for cotton, which is the worst of these row crops here, organic cotton yields are about 45% below conventional crop or cotton yields grown in the same location. So you can see for most of these row crops, there is quite a significant yield difference, typically 40 odd to 20 odd percent. And now it's not every crop. There are some crops where the yield difference is much smaller. Some crops, in fact, where the organic systems are more productive. But that's not generally the case. The yield gap is typically 20 to 40%. And you see a similar story for these vegetable crops, a similar story again for these tree, nut, and vine crops. So why am I telling you this? It's because this yield differential is actually a stake through the heart of the environmental credentials of the organic crop industry. And to understand why, consider this scenario here. So here we have an island, a remote island in the middle of the ocean. And there are three things on this island. There is a village, there is a farm, and there's some wildland. Let's call it a nature reserve, okay? Now the farm is a modern day high-tech intensive farm, and it produces just about enough food to satisfy the needs of the villagers. However, of course, the villagers are reading all about the impacts, the potential impacts of intensive agriculture on the environment, and they're concerned, not surprisingly. So they're placing the farmer under pressure to convert the farm to organic agriculture in order to protect their ecosystem. So how could this actually work? All right, well, if the farmer converted the existing area of the farm to organic, that's okay. But of course, we've seen that there will be a significant yield gap. The farm won't produce enough food. And if nothing else happens, that's not enough food to feed the village anymore. So this is not a sustainable solution. Okay, the obvious thing to do, therefore, is to expand the size of the farm so it produces the same amount of food as it was being produced before. But of course, that means destroying some of the nature reserve. And of course, converting wildland into farmland is just about the worst thing you can do to a piece of wildland, probably second only to covering it in concrete. So from an environmental point of view, this is a terrible solution as well. Okay, well, what if we revert back to plan A then? We just farm the existing area using organic methodology, recognizing we can't produce enough food, that we then give up on the idea of self-sufficiency and simply import any food that we need to make up the shortfall. Now, some of you might recognize this as being the European Union's farm to fork policy. Now, okay, you could do that, but of course, the food on the boat here wasn't needed last year because the island used to be self-sufficient. So this is new food that needs to be produced. So therefore, somewhere else, new land will have to be sacrificed in order to create new farmland. So we're ending up in the same position. This time, the environment will be destroyed somewhere else. It won't be on the island, it will be somewhere else, but it will have to be somewhere. So environmentally, this is still a poor solution. And besides, you may have seen where this argument is going as well. If this is not, in fact, a small island in the middle of the ocean, but in fact, it's a continental landmass on a planet, so we scale this argument up to a planetary scale, of course, our planet has to be self-sufficient in terms of its food production, because there is no second planet from which we can import our food. So in other words, at that scale, this ceases to be an option at all. Okay, so we're struggling here a little bit to see how organic farming could fit in, but there is one other alternative we haven't yet considered, and it's the alternative that's normally promoted by the organic industry. So if the village is as wasteful with its food as the rest of us seem to be, then they waste about a third of the food that's produced by the farm. if we could come up with ways of reducing that food waste down to zero, then we could stand a 30% reduction in yield by converting to organic and still just about have enough food to satisfy the needs of the village. And that is actually true. However, it is not the most environmentally sustainable solution. And to appreciate why, I need to take a more mathematical approach to this same argument. So bear with me here. So consider this diagram here. On the y-axis, we have biodiversity or some other kind of environmental metric. I think biodiversity is the easiest to think about. And on the x-axis, we have land area. And I've tried to draw this to scale, okay? So at the moment on the planet, we have about 40 million square kilometers of forest land remaining. And I think we can agree that the biodiversity of wild forests tends to be uniformly high. We also have about 16 million square kilometers of cropland on the planet. And in comparison, the biodiversity of cropland is very much lower. Okay, this is where we start to get to the heart of the matter now. So it's undeniably true that organic farmland is more environmentally friendly than conventional farmland. Here's a study that's recently published by the University of Oxford showing that organic farms are about 34% more biodiverse than conventional farms. And quite a few other studies came up with similar numbers. 30% is a number that's normally bandied around in the literature. Now, at this point, many people make an assumption. They assume that because organic farms are more biodiverse than conventional farms, therefore, buying organic food is more environmentally friendly than buying conventional food. It seems obvious, does it not? However, even though that's just a little tiny baby step in the argument, that baby step actually contains a fundamental logical flaw. And in fact, that conclusion is not secure. In actual fact, buying conventional food is more environmentally friendly than buying organic food. So how can that possibly be? It sounds completely counterintuitive, doesn't it? So where is this logical flaw? The logical flaw resides in the belief that organic farming is somehow friendly to the environment. That's not true. Almost all farming systems are bad for the environment relative to the wildland that was there before. So consider, if we say that intensive agriculture is really bad for the environment, then organic farmland is 30% better than really bad, which is still pretty damn poor, okay? So if we convert all this existing cropland to organic agriculture, this is the amount of additional biodiversity that we would gain. If you remember, I drew this level at about 10% of the biodiversity of the forests. So 30% better than 10% is 13%. So in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't actually look very much different. Now, you might argue that on a global scale, it's well worth having this additional biodiversity here, but it comes at a price, doesn't it? Because this land here is now nowhere near as productive. If we assume the yield gap is 33%, say, which keeps the mathematics easy, then this land will only produce 2/3 of what we need. If we want to produce the same amount of food as we produced before, we will need to increase the amount of cropland by 50%. So why 50%? It's because this cropland can produce only 2/3 of what we need. Half of it produces 1/3. The second half produces another third. We need another half again to produce 3/3. So in other words, we need to destroy 8 million square kilometers of forest to create this organic world. That's more than the land area of Australia. That's an environmental catastrophe. Or to put it another way, in order to gain this much biodiversity in our cropland, we've had to sacrifice this much biodiversity in our existing forests. And because the area within the red dotted box here is so much bigger than the dark green rectangle here, that's an incredibly bad idea. Okay, so what about the question around reducing food demand? If we reduced our food demand by reducing food waste or changing our diets or whatever, if we reduced our food demand by 33%, then it would be possible to convert all of the existing cropland to organic, improving its biodiversity by this much without actually eating into existing forests. And that's what the organic industry says that we should do. But this is not the most environmentally sustainable solution. If we reset this chart here, If we need to produce 1/3 less food, then an obvious thing to do is simply to farm 1/3 less land. And then if we actively rewilded the land that was liberated, then we could potentially generate this much additional biodiversity. And of course, because this dark green rectangle here is much bigger than this dark green rectangle here, this is by far the most environmentally friendly course of action. So in terms of feeding the village, in actual fact, the status quo is the most environmentally friendly way to go, maximizing the food productivity on the minimum amount of land. And if we manage to reduce the food demand of the village, the most environmentally sustainable course of action will be to reduce the size of the farm, allowing the nature reserve to expand. Okay, so if an organic revolution is not such a great idea for global agriculture, then what sort of revolution do we need? Well, I think the first thing we need to do, well, I need to speed up, actually, it's the first thing I need to do, is to understand what we want our food system to do. What properties do we need? So, very quickly, the system has to produce enough food to feed 10 billion people. That's obvious, that's the population as will be in around about 2050 or so. But that's baseline, there's much more to it than that. The food produced has to be accessible to everyone, obviously, but that places two new constraints on the food system. Firstly, it places a productivity cost constraint because there's no point in producing food if it's too expensive for people to buy. Secondly, it assumes there's a functioning distribution and supply chain between the point of production and the point of consumption for every person on the planet, which would be no mean feat. The food obviously has to have high quality as well. We'd want it to be safe, nutritious, healthy, delicious, convenient, varied. We'd want to have choice. You don't want to have the highest quality rice and beans for every single meal for the rest of your life, do you? Production efficiency must be maximized and input supply must be sustainable. So loads to unpack here, but very briefly, as a general principle, we want to minimize the use of inputs like chemicals and fertilizers and water wherever we can. When we do use inputs, they need to come from renewable sources, ideally products of the circular economy. We need to think about energy, sustainable energy as an input. Where does that come from? We need to think about where our labor comes from. We need to think about how we can reduce waste, not just food waste at the end of the chain, but waste right the way through the value chain. And as you probably recognize, a particular hobby horse of mine is around land. We need to minimize the land footprint of agriculture. We use too much land at the moment. We need to create more room for other ecosystem services like biodiversity preservation. The collateral damage of farming must also be minimized. I've mentioned these things before: pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity, soil. I'd add operator safety to this list as well. In some parts of the world, developing world in particular, India especially, too many farm workers and operators are harmed during farm operations, and we need to do more to actually protect them. The system must be robust and resilient to disruption, not only the disruptions we can predict, like climate change, obviously, but if the last few years have taught us anything at all, we need to be better prepared for things that we can't necessarily predict, like an energy crisis or a war in a breadbasket region or a global pandemic. You know, what's coming next? The system has to be economically sustainable as well. So all members of the food system have to be able to make a fair living. Otherwise, what's their incentive? Why should they bother? I'm particularly concerned here about farmers themselves, well, often squeezed in the middle of the food supply chain. And finally, the system has to be and be seen to be both socially responsible and acceptable. So Exhibit A here is genetically modified crops, which in many ways is a fantastic technology with very few downsides, but it was never socially responsible and never accepted in many parts of the world. Okay, so lots going on here. It should be obvious that there aren't simple technical switches that we can flick in order to make things right. All sorts of things need to come together here. So things like policy, like investment, like infrastructure, like societal attitudes. But there are some places here where the judicious use of science and technology can make a significant beneficial difference. So where are the best opportunities to improve our food system? So in these purple boxes, I hope you recognize some of the grand challenges from this previous slide. Now, to my mind, there are 9 major, exciting, new, potentially disruptive technology spaces that are attracting a lot of attention and a lot of investment at the moment. And 6 of those map quite clearly onto these 5 grand challenges at the top here, but they map in quite a complex way. So I'll try and whiz through this quite quickly and say a little bit about each of these technology areas. The first thing to note is that these grand challenges are not themselves independent from one another. So for example, it's difficult to get good yields if you don't have good soil quality. And yield and biodiversity actually affect each other in both directions, because more biodiverse farmland often gives bigger yields through attracting natural predators of pests and that kind of thing. And also improving yields can improve biodiversity by shrinking the footprint of agriculture, creating spaces for biodiversity to thrive. Okay, but what about the technologies though? Well, the first one is around genetics, or the genetic improvements of crops. So this is all about improving things like the food quality, the yield of the crop, making it more pest resistant and stress resistant. Plant breeders have been doing this for decades, centuries, millennia even. But what's changed recently are the tools in the toolbox that enable us to actually achieve such changes, particularly the development of CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing, you may have heard of, as a tool. So this enables scientists to make very small and precise changes to the DNA that already exists in, well, in any organism you like, really, but including crop plants. So here's just a snapshot of some of the things, only some of the things that have been achieved. And I'm not going to go through this, but you'll see higher yielding crops, salt-tolerant crops, drought-tolerant crops, better tasting fruit and vegetables, nutritionally enhanced crops, safer crops, even pink pineapples and tomatoes that can reduce your blood pressure. All sorts of things are being worked on. Now, the degree to which this will influence society going forward depends entirely on how society decides to regulate this technology. If society treats this like genetic modification, then all of these applications will sink without trace, because that's sufficient to destroy the business case for all of these particular crops that have been developed. If we decide to regulate it in a more rational, science-based way, then I am very optimistic that this is going to be disruptive in a very good way. The quality of our food will increase no end. Pest control is diversifying. So all sorts of things are being tried in terms of increasing our capacity to control pests, all the way from chemical control to one end to biological control on the other, and almost everything in between as well. So synthetic small molecule chemistry is the dominant paradigm at the moment. There are also synthetic chemicals that operate via non-lethal mechanisms. So chemicals that act like molecular vaccines for crop plants that can boost the immune system of the crop plant. So the chemical has no impact whatsoever on pest species, but it enables the plant to better fight off the pests for itself. Then you have things like natural chemicals, which can be pesticidal, or they can actually affect the behavior of things like insects, like pheromones, that kind of thing. Then there are natural biomolecules like proteins and nucleic acids. And we're seeing a few of those coming onto the market at the moment, operating in completely new ways. There are natural extracts of things like plant material or microbial material that contain many different potential natural pesticidal components. Then there are living species like microbes and bacteria and fungi that can be used as pesticides, natural predators like ladybirds and wasps and things like that. And at the extreme biological end, there are some people actually working on genetically modifying pest species and then deliberately releasing them into the environment with fancy genetic modifications within them that cause populations to collapse at an ecosystem level. So I'm not entirely sure that the world is yet ready for genetically modified pest species to be released, but it's certainly scientifically interesting. Biostimulation is taking off at the moment as well. So biostimulants are chemical and biological agents, as I was just describing, that boost crop growth via mechanisms that are nothing to do with either pest control or simple nutrition. So they're not fertilizers, they're not pesticides, they're doing something else. So for example, there are complex biological extracts from things like seaweed or hydrolyzed proteins that can boost crop growth via mechanisms that are not particularly well defined. There are some plant hormone mimics, so mimics of things like strigolactones or gibberellic acid or abscisic acids, which can help plants tolerate environmental stresses like heat or like drought. Some of these biostimulants are living microbes that occupy the soil around the roots, improving soil quality. And some of those microbes can do things like fixing nitrogen from the air, even in non-leguminous crops. hence requiring less additional fertilizer to be added, reducing the potential for pollution. And in the future, I see no reason why similar strategies can't improve food quality while the food is actually growing in the field, though those products don't yet exist. Diagnostics and analytics. This is all about understanding what's going on in the field, using things like sensors embedded in the field, either in the soil or attached to the plant, that kind of thing, or sensing equipment which is scanning horizontally across the crop, like using infrared spectroscopy to identify insects flying over the crop, identifying them by the frequency of their wing beat, which is actually pretty cool. Or you can look at the crop from above, using images taken by drones or by satellites to generate data about what's going on in the field. So lots of diverse data sources, usually then thrown into some kind of AI-based system, artificial intelligence system, which can tell the farmer what is going on in the field at much higher levels of spatial and temporal resolution than has ever been possible before, hence informing what kind of interventions the farmer should use. Regenerative agriculture is a bit of a buzzword, so I need to be careful about what I'm talking about here. This is how Syngenta defines regenerative agriculture as an outcome-based food production system that restores soil health, soil carbon in particular, whilst at the same time protecting the climate, water resources and biodiversity, and crucially at the same time enhancing productivity and profitability on the farm. And this last bit is really important because this is the incentive for farmers to engage with regenerative agriculture. So at the moment, it's not really rocket science. It's practices like minimizing soil disturbance, planting cover crops, thinking more about your crop rotation. But if you get it right and manage to boost profitability at the same time, then this will be great. The soil quality will be improved, biodiversity will be improved, and yields typically will be improved as well. Precision application is all about applying inputs into agriculture only when and where they are required. So inputs like pesticides or fertilizers or water. It relies on diagnostic and analytical tools to know exactly when and where these inputs need to be applied, linked through to actuator systems, which can actually apply these inputs exactly when and where they're applied. So smart spraying systems. So in principle, you can achieve exactly the same output or maybe even improve your output using much less of these inputs, hence vastly reducing the potential for pollution and reducing collateral damage on things like soil and biodiversity. So I'm running out of time here, so I need to skip through really. So advances in all of these technology areas, as you can see, could have a profound impact on all of these challenge areas at the top here, but it doesn't map in a nice, simple, straightforward way. I'll skip over the other three technology areas because I'm running out of time. They are new forms of food, autonomous robotics in the field, and new growing systems, but further discussion of those will have to wait for another day. So I'll just finish off very quickly with some takeaways here. So the global food system has done a good job at producing sufficient food over the last 60 years, but there have been significant environmental costs. Modern day agricultural technologies are often blamed for this damage, but I think that's a bit harsh because the introduction of these technologies prevented the complete destruction of global wildlands in the 20th century, if you remember this argument here. The relentless evolution of technology has quadrupled agricultural productivity over the last 60 years without requiring any additional land, which is good. And our current trajectory is currently on course to satisfy food demand mid-century, if you remember this chart here. No agronomic system has yet been invented which is both adequately productive and acceptably sustainable at a global scale to feed 8 billion people today, 10 billion people in a couple of decades' time. And retreating back to historical farming systems is certainly not the answer. Instead, there are many ways in which new technologies may improve our food system, but society has to be open to their adoption. We can't possibly afford to reject new, potentially beneficial technologies just because we don't like the sound of them. So I've overrun a little bit. Sorry about that, but I'll stop there. Thanks very much. Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dave. It was a fascinating talk, and we have plenty of questions, so I'll have to, I'm afraid we will not have time to go for all of them, so I'll have to pick. I'm sorry if I skip you, but yeah, so we have, for example, David Osborne asking, isn't farming in the oceans for crops and even fuels and by cell culture for meat in factories not the answer to these issues?
I don't think a lot of people suggest that individual technologies is the answer. For me, there is no single answer. There cannot be a single answer. It will be a mosaic of different approaches that will help us rise to these kind of challenges. And you make a good point that the contributions of those kind of technologies that have been mentioned could well be significant, for sure. You know, cell-based meat is one of the things that I skipped over actually on the previous slide. It was looking really very good a year before last, but then last year it took a bit of a nosedive in terms of investment. It looks like lots of people were trying things like plant-based meats for the first time, but very few of them were going back for a second taste. The critical thing is that if you're going to produce something which is going to replicate meat, it has to be at least as delicious as meat in order to get people to return, even if not more so. And so I'm not sure we're just there yet. So will this scale? I don't know. It depends on how delicious it is. It could easily be just second generation veggie burgers. So we will see.
Thank you very much. I had a question about biostimulation, and it was someone in the audience, Katrina, had essentially the same question. So biostimulation sounds very interesting. How mature is this technology at the moment, and how is it regulated?
How much what, sorry? What was the first
How mature is it, and how well regulated is it?
Well, okay. Well, it's not new. There have been biostimulant products around for a long time, decades now, though they're often things like biological extracts. I mentioned seaweed, you know, that's been around for a long time, and it does seem to have a statistically significant effect. The thing that's really changing at the moment is our understanding of basic plant sciences, giving us clues as to where we may play around within plant physiology and biochemistry to achieve the kind of effects that we're really looking for. So it's more around the rational design of biostimulant effects, which is really changed. And that's what's creating the excitement. So I mentioned plant hormones. It's a good place to start because they are natural chemicals produced by the plant designed to generate physiological effects. But there are many other things that we could think about doing as well. So it's almost like a pharmaceutical approach to improving plant health rather than pesticide science. So some bits of it are mature and products have been around for a long time. Other elements to this are really rather new and very exciting.
Thank you. Susan Gray has the question about, so they ask, do you consider the phyllosilica additives will improve the soil quality?
It's a little out of my area of expertise. I'm not sure I've got a mature answer to that question. It's a bit specific for me, I'm afraid. So all sorts of different soil additives are being proposed at the moment, things like biochar to improve carbon, that kind of thing, as a way of keeping carbon in the soil. I think I didn't mention carbon markets, but that's obviously another area to this. The soil being a potential sink of atmospheric carbon, and whether we can keep keep carbon in the soil for long enough to make a difference. It's an emerging space. I'm not really sure what the answer is, but it's certainly interesting to observe. So I'm afraid I don't have a good answer to the specific question, but using soils in ways that we haven't considered before, I think is really exciting.
Thank you very much. We have so many questions. We'll have to do the last one, I'm afraid. But James Garrett asks, your model of the island was very instructive, which I fully agree with. However, you did not include the environmental costs of fertilizers in the model. Would including these change the outcomes?
I think the model is independent of the specific technologies that we're talking about. So all technological inputs have benefits and they have costs as well. So I think just considering productivity versus biodiversity is not a bad axis to actually examine. Going down to the individual technology levels, I'm not sure is that much more instructive. So clearly fertilizers will have some benefit, and if they run off, as I mentioned before, then they will have impact as well. I'm not sure the model is sophisticated enough to generate insights at that kind of level.
Thank you very much. I found the model really, really instructive, and the way you walked through it, it was really clear. So thank you very much for that and for the whole presentation. It was lovely and really instructive. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I have some slides to share.
Okay.
Just to finish up, to round up, if you don't mind. Let me just quickly do that. But yeah, thank you again, Dave, for such a fascinating talk. We talked about so many different aspects of the food system, and talking a lot about biodiversity. And I really like how you explain really simply with those green boxes the effect that organic or non-organic, more conventionally called agriculture have, the impact they have on the environment. So thank you very much again for your talk.
You're very welcome.
Just as some last slides, again, thank you all for all the attendees. If you enjoy this talk, we do them quite often. You will see them advertised on the SCI website. And if you've enjoyed them, why not consider joining SCI? Being a member has plenty of benefits, such as preferential rates on some of our conferences, the use of a business centre in London, or access to social network tools, for example. We do these talks quite often, as I say. The next one is in May on life cycle assessment. And in June, we have one on seaweed and how to build a waste-free world with it. So we could find some links with the talk today as well. So if you want to sign up to those, again, they're free of charge, and you can find them on the SCI website. But with that, I'd like to thank you all the attendees, as well as Dave for such a great talk. And we'll see you next month. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.